thank you for the invitation to share words of God with you in this treasured series, and many things. Today, in the company of Jeremiah, I would like to offer an alternative metaphor for these 40 days of Lent: exile. Many of us who will observe this holy season are feeling something like exiles right about now, especially in this country. Now, some may want to correct me and say that being under subjugation in our own country is not exile, for exile is deportation to another country. And you are correct. And some may say they have experienced no subjugation in this country, and in many cases that is correct as well. But when any of us are not free, then none of us are free, and I submit that we are in exile, but for some, the conditions are so comfortable and the decor is so familiar that they are unaware that they are in exile until one of the emperor's executive orders catches up with them. I submit to you that there are folk who are looking at everything around them and seeing such a profoundly different world that they might as well be in an entirely different country, in exile, because the world around them, before and behind them, above and below them, has changed in such catastrophic, consequential, and even vicious and violent ways. Today, in speaking to those who find themselves waking up in Babylon every morning alongside Jeremiah's postmaster, I believe there is a word for us in Jeremiah's declaration that although he may not be with God's people in exile, there are yet prophets in Babylon. Prophets in Babylon. Surely there are prophets in Babylon as well, but today we're talking about prophets. The words and the word they hear, and the one who speaks to and through them, whose word travels to every place, in every circumstance in which we find ourselves, even in exile. And perhaps the practice of some to look to their prophets for wisdom rather than listening to their prophets may be just how we found ourselves in exile, living in Babylon, even though we wake up in our own beds every morning. You see, a nation that saw itself as a gleaming city upon a hill has crumbled due to internal and external fractures, pressures, and assaults. Divisions between groups of people are being etched into the societal fabric, perhaps never to be fully reintegrated again. The power-hungry have overplayed their hand and found themselves mere puppets of one whose astronomical wealth has eclipsed their own. I'm talking about the United States of Babylon, where there was a king upon the throne who had been put there by folk who knew he could have never gotten there on his own. And with that meddling and manipulation came the expectation that his executive orders would support the economic, national, and international priorities of those who put him on the throne and could take him off and take him out and replace him with someone else, someone more cooperative. There is a lesson here as well for those who would choose the glittering gods of colonizing empires. They will not protect you. They have no interest in your well-being. You are just another log for the fire. In his first 100 days, the plutocrat puppeteer who was pulling the king's strings issued a whole series of destabilizing initiatives that affected the powerless and, to their surprise, the privileged as well, with the result that the people were forcibly divided into those they thought mattered, had value and worth, and those for whom they had no use. The poor, those from other nations who did the backbreaking work necessary to support and feed the empire that saw them as the dirt beneath their feet. I'm still talking about the United States of Babylon. Babylon took captive those for whom they had use and those they didn't trust to be out of their sight, and sent them into exile. There was no one so rich, so cultured, so qualified, so important, so protected that they could negotiate with Babylon, with the empire on their own terms. They were all carried away into exile, whether they secretly admired the tyrant taking them or despised the despot dispossessing them. And Jeremiah was left behind and thus began writing epistles like the one whose words we heard today. These are the words of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the remainder of the elders among the exiles, and to the priests, the prophets, and all the people, the women, children, and men whom Nebuchadnezzar had taken into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. This was after the departure of King Jeconiah and the queen mother, the court officials, the leaders of Judah and Jerusalem, the artisans and the smiths from Jerusalem in a previous exile. Other prophets were counted among the literati, the glitterati, and the Illuminati. But Jeremiah wasn't considered good enough, cool enough, or even dangerous enough to be taken captive by Babylon, to be held in exile, to be seduced, to be co-opted, to be colonized. For that is what Babylon does. And there's a lesson here for those who think they are outside of the politics and the power struggles, those whom the world deems insignificant, those whose gifts and talents the empire discounts. All Jeremiah had was words, God's words in his words. They would prove to be more than enough, but the empire didn't know to tremble at mere words yet. Now, some of you may be doubting the power of words right now. Words of resistance, words of protest, words of comfort, words of encouragement. Words have power. Use your words. What was wrong with Jeremiah? Perhaps you wonder. Jeremiah was a prophet, but apparently an illiterate one, needing Baruch to write and read for him. Jeremiah was a priest, but from the wrong clan on the wrong side of the tracks. Having ancestors who voted for the losing candidate when there was a choice between David's sons, Absalom and Solomon. And they chose the one who tried to pave his way to the throne through sexual violence against women. I'm talking about the disunited states of Judah and the remnants of 2.5 tribes that survived the Assyrian annihilation. And Jeremiah was from the tribe of Benjamin, infamous for another failed candidate, Saul. His tribe was also responsible for some of the most grotesque physical and sexual violence in the scriptures, the gang rape of the Levite's secondary wife, and his tribe was responsible for protecting the perpetrators to the point of a genocidal war that ended with mass abduction of girls forced to bear their children. Nearly 3,000 years later, forced pregnancies are one of the signs of our exile from a country where the dignity of every human person is protected and respected. Jeremiah did not make the colonizers' cut. He and Baruch would eventually find their way to Egypt, and that is a whole other sermon. those who had the potential to be holy troublemakers, leaders, elders, prophets, artisans, musicians, craftspersons were all taken into exile with the woman who could have run the country on her own, but some folk will always choose an unqualified man over a qualified woman. The Babylonians understood that resistance is found not just in the megaphones of a street protest, but in arts and crafts and in the wisdom of our elders. They left the poorest of the people with the fewest marketable skills, behind as a cheap labor force to support them, to support the ravenous appetite of the colonizing forces that had just gobbled up Judah and Jerusalem, the yawning mouth and insatiable hunger of Babylon. Oh, Babylon, bright lights and big city. If you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. Some of the people taken captivity in Babylon were held hostage in such beautifully gilded cages that they may not have realized that they were being reinculturated, co-opted, and re-educated. You see, there would be no Judean history taught in schools. There would be no language and culture of Jerusalem on the state curriculum. Israelite religion and culture would be banned along with DEI, Black history, Asian history, Latina history, Native American history, and queer studies, and now apparently the Tuskegee Airmen being scrubbed from the websites of the Department of Defense. They were slowly but surely being turned into Babylonians. At least that was the plan. But surely some switched their loyalty on their own upon seeing the shining one up on that gold-plated throne. Some will always be captured by proximity and privilege. But some were just trying to figure out how to survive when the world was pulled out from under them like a rug, and they woke up every morning in a world that was the opposite of everything they had been raised to believe, but still expected to smile and nod and play along. During that wilderness season where the people were being pulled apart and positioned to be set against each other, Jeremiah called Baruch to take up an epistolary pen and wrote a series of pastoral letters, including Jeremiah chapter 29 and the epistle to Baruch, which is canonical to we Episcopalians along with our Catholic and Orthodox kinfolk. Jeremiah's tone is very different from the story of the three trafficked Hebrew boys, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, given the slave names Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were willing to die rather than bow down before the tyrant who had trafficked them. But Jeremiah knows that miracles are rare and precious things, and his people cannot afford to gamble what's left of their one precious life at the whim of their dictator. He knows that God does not always show up in the easiest and most miraculous of ways. Sometimes we have to figure out how to live between the miracles. And so Jeremiah has a completely different message: survive. Survive, survive. He tells them to marry and have babies and to pray for the wicked place in which they are being held in exile. Build houses and settle in them. Plant gardens and eat their fruit. Take women as wives and father sons and daughters. Take women as wives for your sons and give them men, to husbands, that they may give birth to daughters and sons. Multiply there and do not decrease, and seek the well-being of the city where I have sent you all into exile, and pray to the God who hears on its behalf, for in its well-being will be your well-being. Now wait up a minute, God. You want us to pray for Babylon? Don't you know what they have done? Don't you know what they are doing right now? God tells the people to pray for their Babylon because God knows that if the empire crumbles, it will crash and burn on top of them. I know there are people who think our Babylon is beyond the power of prayer. Now, that's me every other Tuesday and Friday. But God calls us to pray for our Babylon because in its well-being is our well-being. And as dangerous as a living Babylon is, A dying, falling Babylon on fire would be an utter catastrophe to everyone in or around it. Jeremiah tells the people to survive so they can thrive. One day, but you see, they're going to be there a while. Jeremiah tells them that it will not be an easily programmable 40 days of Lent. Jeremiah is ticking off generations. And in the epistle to Baruch, he goes so far as to say, bow down if you have to, but just say in your heart, it is you, Holy One, and you alone whom I worship. Do what you need to survive in Babylon. See, Jeremiah understands that the people's captivity is no passing or trifling thing. And if they are not careful, they will find themselves written out of history as a bloody streak beneath Babylonian feet. These days, I find Babylonian exile to be an apt metaphor for Lent. Even though Lent is a fixed 40-day period and is marked by intentional spiritual practices reenacting the physical and spiritual isolation and communion of Jesus' time in the wilderness, many of us are going through or have gone through social and spiritual isolation that have no fixed end, that have no liturgical celebration marking their conclusion. Some of us are not just in the wilderness on a 40-day journey. Some of us are here on a 40-year journey. You see, in the wilderness, there are two kinds. There's the Judean wilderness, and you can count the days to its transformation. You can mark it on a calendar. You know when the snow is going to melt and the flowers are going to bloom. It is like a liturgical season, but there is also the lifeless wilderness that stands between life and death, between enslavement and freedom, between bondage and liberation. And that is no mere 40-day wilderness. That is a 40-year wilderness. Some of us are in Babylon and we don't know if we will ever return home. We don't know if we will have a home to which to return. Will we ever be able to remove the stain and corruption of Babylon from our shining city on the hill? It just may be that when these 40 days are over, we will be shouting our alleluias in a world that still looks, smells, tastes, feels, hurts, and kills like Babylon. For indeed, crucifixions did not cease after that terrible Friday, but that too is another sermon. In the scriptures and in the world that interprets them, Babylon is much more than a place. It is the evil of imperialism, the cruelty and corruption of capitalism, the brutality of policing forces, the terrorizing of tyrants, and the dehumanization of despots, all rolled into one. From the revelation to Rastafari, Babylon is hell on earth. And yet, not even Babylon is devoid of God's presence and proclamation through God's servants, the prophets. There are indeed prophets in Babylon. You see, the Babylonians messed up and brought prophets with the people into exile. Maybe they thought they could co-opt them and have them proclaim a word on their behalf, a word on behalf of their gods. And there are indeed prophets preaching a Babylonian gospel. But God prepared the people for that exile by sending prophets into exile with them. Perhaps the Babylonians thought they could use those prophets to pacify the people. But it turns out that at least some of the prophets were part of an underground railroad, passing messages back and forth from Jeremiah so that the community would not forget who they were and whose they were. They were the people of the God who meets her children in exile. They were the people to whom God had provided prophets at every stage of their journey. Miriam and Moses in the wilderness, Deborah to fight their battles in Canaan. Isaiah and his woman prophet birthing and raising their children with prophetic names, including, some say, Emmanuel. And that's why God says at the end of our lesson, I sent you to my servants, the prophets, women and men in advance, but they would not listen. God prepared the people for exile, for the captivity that was inevitable based on the actions of a few invested with power of which they were not worthy, whose self-interest, gluttonous greed, and inhumanity to the people around them led them to right where they were. God warned them through every prophet, short and tall, curly and bald, woman and man, aged and young. But God does not wash God's hands of God's people. Even as the people were headed down a path to a place from which they could not return on their own, God packed her bags and came with them into exile. That is the TLDR of Ezekiel. But do read it and understand that the horrific violence in it is his trauma response, which we can understand but not excuse. Ezekiel preached and taught the people in Babylon that God is Emmanuel, with us even in Babylon. There are prophets in Babylon, but are they preaching submission to the Savior or submission to the system? There are prophets who were taken captive, and there are, the people say, new prophets whom God has raised up in Babylon. And then there is Jeremiah and Baruch, sending him to the post office day after day. There are so many prophets in Babylon. How do we know who is the right one? How do we know who is the next great man in the lineage? You know how we do. Who is the next Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? Funny how no one is looking for the next El Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, Malcolm X, and nobody is looking for the next Coretta Scott King or Betty Shabazz. There are all of these prophets in Babylon doing God's work while nobody records their names. Others taken captive in body and mind, preaching the gospel of Babylon. But there are yet prophets in exile, preaching the gospel of the God who hears. That gospel starts with something that looks a whole lot like Lent. When you call upon me and you come and you pray to me, I shall hear you. And when you all seek me, you shall find me. If you seek me with your whole heart, I will be found by you. Call upon the God who is waiting to hear from you. Leave the pleasures of Babylon behind and seek the God who is willing to be found. Spend some time in prayer and reflection and meditation and study, and spend some time serving somebody other than yourself. Even if you are both in exile, spend some time in silence. Push away that plate filled with Babylonian delicacies. Take off those Babylonian robes and strip yourself down to the person you were before you went to Babylon. Find out who you are under that new Babylonian name. Find that part of you that can never be taken captive, that can never be taken hostage, that belongs to God and only God. Pray and wait, whether it's 40 days or 40 years. Know that the word of God through her servants, the prophets, is true. God shall save, God shall redeem, God shall gather, God shall restore. In the Jerusalem to Babylon Pony Express, Jeremiah speaks for God who promises, I shall reverse your captivity and gather you from all the nations and all the places I have driven you. There is no Babylon beyond the reach of God. There is no exile so far that God cannot find you. There is no captivity so hard that can erase all of God's people from the earth. But Babylon is trying, because certain kinds of people have no value in Babylon. Some folk are only useful for what they can do or who their connections are. But God's salvation doesn't make those distinctions. God's salvation is for those carried away to Babylon and those left behind. And for those who repent, there is even salvation for Babylonians. There are prophets in Babylon, but more than that, there is a God in Babylon who has never been taken captive, who has never lost a battle. There is a God who is not even dependent upon her priests and prophets to speak to her people. There's a God calling us out of the Babylon of our own making. There's a God calling us on a sacrificial journey to leave behind the trappings and pleasures that have ensnared us. There's a God who will walk with us on the way to liberation. There's a God who will bear the weight of our burdens and shepherd us when we wander off the path. There is a God waiting for us to leave Babylon, walking beside us and waiting with open arms at our journey's end. There's a God who will set us free from Babylon while we are yet in exile. There's a God who sets prisoners and captives free inside crumbling empires like Egypt and Babylon and Rome, and if we are not careful, right here at home. There's a God who is greater than Babylon, yet condescends to speak to and through it as long as there is even one soul held captive. There's a God whose word reaches to the ends of the earth, to all of the places her children are held captive and exile. And that is why Jesus went into exile in a virgin's womb. Jesus was born in the exile of the Roman occupation of his own country. Jesus was born into the exile of human flesh. Jesus was born in an exile that was an incarnation. Jesus was born into a world in which his exile looked like brutality and torture and beatings and betrayal and crucifixion. But not even exile could hold Jesus down. Jesus released himself from his own exile when he rose, and he stands there to receive us as one of his own. Exile is a temporary affair, whether it's 40 days or 40 years. On our journey, we will never be alone. Jesus will be with us, and when times get hard, we will look around and find that there are prophets in Babylon.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Gafney. She'll be here at the bottom of the steps to greet you as you leave. And as a people in exile, let us find ways to go in peace, to love and serve the Lord.